All right, so we're ready to do lab 1. As before, the first things I have up are my data sheet. So at this point, it's the so-called original one, because the original is the version with all the variables labeled. Okay, so don't start from the Excel primer, start from original. And on the right, you see my lab guide, which again looks long, but it's because it's a bunch of pasted sample tables. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start from section A here, prepping a table. So, but the very first thing, notice that it says is open this data, save as, and rename it as the same thing but lab 1. So here we go, save as, and right now it says Heil original. I'm going to turn into Heil490 lab 1. Okay, and I already actually have it, but that's fine. I'm replacing it. Done. All right, so now I have a new lab 1, fresh, ready to go. So to move forward, we're going to eventually we're going to have 3 tabs. One's going to be a pivot table when we get there. But the next, so this original tab here is data, and we're going to make a new one called averages, okay? And remember, tabs, that's how we switch back and forth between data and pivot. And we need a new one, we just can press plus, right? So here's data, next to it's a little plus sign, and I have a new sheet. As with the Excel primer, you'll be renaming this because staying organized is extremely important. If you ever need to refer back to data later, having stuff be very well organized and labeled makes a huge difference, right? It's the same reason why we labeled our so-called original labeled data as original, so that when you're going into your folder, you're like, which one do I start with? It should be self-explanatory, I would hope. So anyway, this new sheet, which currently says sheet 1, I'm going to rename, either right-click rename or double-click, and I'm going to call it averages. Now, I'm going to make myself a table, okay? And I'm just going to, let's zoom in so it's a little bit easier to see, okay? And I'm going to cheat and wrap text ahead of time, but and I'm going to make my columns a little wider. You can do this after you enter these titles, or you could, I guess, leave it. It's easier if you make them wider first. But okay, so I'm just going to copy over the word subset from the top left of this table, and then I need to rename the other things for whatever my variables are. Now, if you look kind of at the top of the next page, you see mine actually applied. So it's going to depend on what yours was. But for example, my action rate is about wrench juggling. So column B is the average of wrench juggling. That's what AVE is intended to communicate, is average. And then SD is standard deviation, wrench juggling. Now my language rate, column E, is complementizer per sentence. So average complementizer per sentence, and then SD complementizer per sentence. There's a note here, as you'll see, in A5. Here's a footnote 1. It has to do with dragging and making these slightly different sizes. I might tweak them, perhaps. I actually kind of want, let's see, I think I like the way that looks, maybe. Maybe I want my average in the same line. It doesn't matter, but this is something that if you feel like tweaking what it looks like, you can click and drag by choosing the vertical line in between the column headers, so A, B, and you grab it and you drag. Or if you double click, it'll auto size to a certain degree and so on and so forth, okay? But this is up to you. It's just cosmetic. The cosmetic pieces are really not my biggest concern at all. The organization stuff, I care. The cosmetic stuff, I don't care. I'll do it for mine, but don't worry about it. Okay, so all right, drag them so they're readable. If you wrapped text, maybe that's easy. If not, it'll be really wide. And then I'm going to save. So boop, now I've saved it. So the A6 was saved. No. Section B, working with formulas. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to add these subsets. So here's group 1, short fur, group 2, curly fur, location 1, this long looking thing with an R, location 2, this shorter looking thing with a K, and then location 3, this thing with a lot of K's and I's. Cool. All right, save. So in order to fill out this table, we're going to use 2 strategies. To get the, apologies, all. In order to get one that's sort of all of the data at once, it's easiest to kind of, well, it is fairly easy to use formulas, okay? And we're going to use very simple formulas just to get the practice because you'll have a couple throughout the semester, not a ton, but some. And then we're going to use a pivot table to get the rest because doing it with formulas will be more complex than doing a pivot table, like significantly more complex. So let's start with the formulas. And that's one of the things I'll be looking for when I'm grading this is that the formulas are where I've asked you to put them and they are what I've asked you to do, okay? So going back to the data tab, boop, now I'm here. In the lab guide, it has asked you to click on cell D32, so column D, so row 32 is this cell. So it's the first cell under the data. And I've asked you to type in this formula here in B2 equals average D2 colon D31 with parentheses and all that. So equals average parentheses D2 colon D31. If you're curious, what we're looking at here is the equal sign is signaling to Excel that you have a formula. Average is the function that you're applying to some data set. And then in the parentheses, and the Excel's really picky, you need the parentheses, although sometimes it will autofill in the last one. But you need parentheses, and inside of that is the range to which your function is going to be applied, okay? In this case, D2 to D31, to indicate a range, it happens to use a colon. I'm just telling you what you're looking at. The truth is that when I want you to use a formula, I'll have you put in a specific place with specific values so that you don't have to dissect that formula. So copying it, as long as you put it in the right spot, should be fine, okay? But in case you were curious, that is how the anatomy of this formula is, okay? So average. And I'm gonna look at this average and I'm gonna ask myself, does this make sense? You know, and it should, right? So the average of the D, so the wrench juggling rate, there's a lot of stuff above 100 and below 100. So for the average to be just below 100, to me is reasonable. I think that's reasonable, okay? All right, so the next thing to do is get this value over into the averages table. Okay, so it's going to go here in B2. And I can do that in a couple of ways. So I can eyeball it and go, yeah, 98.9. I can just type that over. You always have that option, okay? If you have a lot of them, you can jot them down on paper. Just be really careful they don't get disorganized. The other option, of course, is to copy paste, which is either right click and copy, or it's Control C, or if you're on a Mac, it's like Function C, right? And then you come over here and you paste it. But one thing I want to point out, this cell under the hood isn't a number, it's a formula because we typed it in and we pressed enter. And so it's actually a formula. We're just looking at the value. But notice that the value I see in D32 and what I see up here in the formula bar aren't the same thing because what it is actually is a formula. Now it has to do with its position in the sheet, what value is here. So if I were to paste this, so I'm going to use Control V, but you can use Function V if you're on a Mac, or you can right click, choose paste. You can choose paste up here on the top left, whatever. If I just straight up paste it without any considerations, I actually pasted the formula. But notice that because there are not 30 some cells above B2, it's confused. It says, hey, I don't have anything to reference. That's what this, hashtag reference business or a pound sign reference thing is about. And so it's confused. So there's two ways to fix this. You actually need to paste values is what it is. And so I can do that once I've pasted this. If I don't touch anything else, there's a pop-up that always comes here, paste options. And you can click into it and this little sub menu will show up. And this sub menu is your friend if you're doing copy paste. So it does automatically pop up if you paste something, no matter what, and you can kind of mess with it. And the most important thing to be aware of is this thing here called paste values. It's a whole row in this version of Excel, but the very first one, just regular values, is value. Number formatting, source formatting. If you want to be really specific, you could, but I'm just going to choose values. Okay, so that's one way to copy paste, right? So again, I pasted. So let me make sure it's copied again. You know it's ready when it has this little lined box around the cell. So I can paste and then change it in the pop-up, or I can go into the sort of this home tab across the top, find paste, but instead of clicking the regular paste button, I go slightly below it and find this drop-down menu. So it's like a little arrow, and then I choose paste values there. So those are my two options, okay? So bookmark this spot if you haven't mastered it and come back. There is some notes about it if you look at, yeah, so footnote 2 on page 2 talks about this, but I'm not going to repeat this ad nauseum. It does, so this applies to anytime you're trying to copy values, as we're doing in this exact moment, okay? So then, yeah, I'm going to do the same thing with standard deviation. Okay, so now I'm back here, and I want to get standard deviation. So if you go back to the guide, we've already done B1, 2, 3, 4. I've copied it over. And now I'm going back to the data sheet. I'm on B5 now. Go back to the data sheet and click on cell D33, which is the cell below where you just were. And here's a new formula, equals STDEV parentheses D2 colon D31 end parentheses. Okay, and that's, I'm a formula. I want standard deviation. The range to which it applies is D2 to D31. Okay. If you're a whiz at this, once you open the parentheses, you could click and drag as well, FYI. But okay, and so then I've got lots and lots of decimals here, so I could hand copy if I don't want all of them, or I can tweak the number of decimals. There's a note about tweaking the number of decimals here at the bottom of page 3, right? I actually don't care if you have too many decimals. Like when I say too many, I mean just consistency. But just FYI that there are ways to tweak that I will probably do when I finished doing this, but no rush. All right. So now this formula is average. This formula is standard deviation, so D32 and D33 respectively. And now I want the same thing for the complementizer rate, okay? So notice that I've copied both of those things over. I want the same thing for complementizer rate. So actually now I want to copy the formulas, as a matter of fact, as opposed to copying values. Now, just sometimes you want the values and sometimes you want the formulas. So here, I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it, but I'm not going to touch this values menu. I'm just going to leave it as it is. And now you see, so if I highlight D32, the formula bar says average D2 through D31. But if I highlight E32, my formula bar says average E2 to E31. And if I click up there, you'll see it applies to these cells, right? That's what I wanted. I'm going to do the same thing with standard deviation, right? And you'll notice that that's very different than the value. So here's the standard deviation for column D is almost 50. The standard deviation for column E is like just over 2. And again, if we use our number sense to see if this average was calculated correctly, it's almost 3, and my values in the complementizer rate column are 0 to 6. That's about right. So now I got to copy these over. So I'm going to take the average, so E32 of column E, and paste it into the average complementizer per sentence. And once again, I need to paste values in this case, and copy, paste, change to values. Okay, super. So now I have all, the row all is filled, okay? Now, as I mentioned, we're going to use a pivot table to do the other piece, because doing it this way with formulas is really, it's kind of a pain. It can be done, absolutely can be done, but it involves some filtering and reordering and stuff, which we don't want to do right now. Okay, so I have done in my guide, highlight cells and copy them, paste the values, blah, 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 right? And then copy them over. I'm at the bottom of section B. It has asked me to save, which I will now do again, so I don't lose my progress. And then get back to the pivot tables. All right, so getting, as it says here, getting averages and standard deviations for the groups and locations is much easier with a pivot table. So we will highlight all the cells in the data tab, except the ones with formulas in them. That is to say, from A1 down to E31. So I'm going to click on A31 and drag to select down to E31. Okay, so everything here that isn't a formula. Okay, just my normal table ignoring the formulas. I've selected it. Now we have to insert a pivot table, as we did before. So go over to the insert sort of tab along the top and pick pivot table. Bam. As before, we're going to choose new worksheet, so it should be ready to go if you've selected the right data. And press OK. I want to rename this now. Call it pivot, please, just for organizational purposes. All right, and then we return. So let's see. Highlight them all, insert a pivot is C2, C3 in the pivot sheet. So now that we're in the, oh yeah, I named the sheet pivot. So C3, in the pivot sheet, put group in the rows box. So here's group. I'm going to drag it down to rows. Okay. And you'll see now that in my pivot table, types of fur, which were my groups, have popped up. And then for the variables corresponding to columns D and E, I'm still in C3 here, D and E into the values box. So my wrench juggling, I'm going to put that down in values. Complementizer rate, I'm going to put down in values. Okay. For each of the variables in the value box, we don't actually want sum, right? Sum is not informative here. So curly fur, my sum right now is like 1,300 and something, which tells me nothing about how often they're doing something. It's just, I could have one person juggling wrenches 1,000 times a week and everybody else doing it like 10 times, and it'll be close to this number. So sum isn't going to help me. So instead, you'll notice it asks you to go into the values box and then find value field settings from the options. So again, I'm in values. Right now it says sum of wrench juggling. I'm clicking on the little arrow. The last option that comes up is value field settings. And I'm now going to pick average. Okay, so it should say average of wrench juggling. Okay. And I'm going to do the same thing with my complementizers. Value field settings, average. Okay. All right, and so then I need to copy these guys over. So a little disclaimer about copying them. If you're trying to copy, let's say, 2 of these at a time, because you're like, they're next to each other in the table, you need to be careful about the order over here on the left side. Notice that, so at the top of page 4 now, under number 5, where I'm trying to copy things over, in the table, I put them in short fur, curly fur. So if you didn't put them in an alphabetical order originally in your table, it's possible that right now it'll simplify your life to go back and make them alphabetical. Mine just aren't, which is okay. But if you do that, copy paste is a little faster. The other option is whatever order they are in the table, I can change it inside the pivot table. So you can obviously copy paste them individually and the order doesn't matter. But I can also go in here. If I highlight one of these, so I'm going to just click on short fur, right click. There's an option called move. It just kind of reorders stuff. And I'm going to move short fur to the top. So now short fur and curly fur here happen to match my averages table. So I'm going to copy them. And so I'm going to copy the average of wrench juggling for the short fur, go over to the averages table, and bam. Now the pivot table is not a formula under the hood, so you don't have to paste values. You can just copy paste, copy paste, copy paste. That's another nice little thing about pivot tables. Average of wrench juggling for curly fur, copy and paste, right? And that's a good, so doing them individually is a good strategy if the order on column A, it doesn't match your pivot table, okay? If they happen to, as I've changed mine, you also can highlight both and then paste. Bam, okay? And I'll, if you're curious about cleaning up the decimals, it's here in footnote 3, but I'll do it at the end too. Okay, so great. Now we've got values for all the stuff. Notice that they match what's going on in the lab guide, 109.1, 88.7. Yeah, this is what I have over here in the Excel sheet. 3.4, 2.4, yep, that's also correct. Good. Now I need standard deviation for these guys. So I'm going to go back to the pivot table, and what I'm going to do is change it in the value field settings. And we're going to go down to standard deviation, press OK, and do it the same for complementizer rate as well. Go down to standard deviation, press OK. All right, so now I have standard deviation for the 2 variables. So here's wrench juggling, copy, paste, and complementizer rate, copy, paste. Okay, and if you look back over here in the version that shows up in the lab guide, so changing the value field settings was step 6 on page 4, and then number 7 should show the pasted values. Notice that these match up: 47.7, 48.5, and then 2.2 and 2.1, right? That matches up just fine. And then I'm going to repeat with locations. So go back to pivot table. I'm going to take group out of the rows. So you just click and drag it out, like throwing it out the door. Grab my location, minus treetops, put that down in rows, and then I can copy paste these. And once again, so right now it says standard deviation. So I'm just going to copy standard deviation first. Just keep that in mind, okay? And you'll notice that once again, the order of the rows of the locations in this case does not match my original pivot table. So once again, if you wanted, you could change your averages table, excuse me, your averages table to be alphabetical and it would automatically be perfect. You copy them as they are. The other option is once again to move them around. So they're showing up here as KRT, so Kachiro, Ruruguro, and Thikiana, KRT in the pivot table. They are RKT in the averages table. Just mine happened to be that way. So it looks like I'm just gonna reorder these for my sake. Again, this is, you know, a way to do it. You also can copy them directly. You could have made the averages table alphabetical, whatever. Okay. But now notice they match RKT and then RKT. Great. So now I'm going to copy the standard deviation for all three locations of the action rate, so wrench juggling, and pop it over here. And then I'm going to copy the standard deviation of the complementizer rate, which is the language rate, and I'm going to put it over here. And you'll notice that short of the decimal places, those match what I have in the lab guide on page 4 at the bottom. So 4.8, 4.6.9, 46.9. Look at that, I didn't copy it right the first time. Yeah, because Ruruguro is supposed to be 46. Okay, so these are copied poorly in the lab report. It's fine. So that's exactly my point. If you don't order them right, they won't be correct. But you know, you live and you learn. Okay, so this is what it ought to be: 4.6, 4.8, 5.1, or 51. Sorry, 46, 48, 51. Okay, and then go back and change it over to averages. Do the same thing. Okay. But my point precisely is that the ordering when you copy should be correct. And clearly at some point I did not copy them correctly, but here you can see this is what they're supposed to be. So yeah, I didn't fix it when I did it originally, but here it is, okay? All right, so this is the final version of this. At this point you can save and close it. Okay, I will probably mess with your Excel sheet just to make sure stuff is correct. You know, I wouldn't give myself full points. Fun. Okay. And then the thing I told you about the decimal places, if you desire, and often I do, you can go into the home place, into section that says number, and there's this two little options under the format bar. It says increase decimal and decrease decimal. It kind of looks like 0.00 and then arrow to 0.0. If I click on this, I can tweak it, right? So yeah, you can go left and right until you have the number you want. I happen to just like 1 decimal. It doesn't matter. You could do 2, you could do 3. Just takes up more space. Okay? Yeah? And then you would have it. All right, so here you go. This is the final one that you would copy and paste into the lab report. So when you do section A, so the quiz for the NHL part A, you need to copy this over because you have to talk about it. It is set up so that you should be able to copy and paste it fidelitously, but you can also paste it into a Word document, upload that too. I can always read it, okay? The quizzes are set up so you can upload files into them if you need to, so just keep that in mind. Another cute little thing I like is to add borders, but no big. All right, this file is ready to go, so save it. Close it, and then you can upload this and it's ready to be turned in for Lab 1. If you have any questions, please let me know. As I have very clearly shown you, you need to be careful about the ordering in the pivot table when you're copy and pasting because it can be wrong. So please be careful with that. Okay? All right, send me questions and I'll see you in class.